Octavian, now Augustus, stood as the unchallenged master of the Roman world. The bodies of Antony and Cleopatra were treated with a cold, political pragmatism. Antony was granted a private funeral by the victor, a final nod to their shared passion to the man who had once been Caesar's greatest general. Cleopatra was buried beside him, according to some accounts, in a tomb whose location was then deliberately lost to history. Augustus understood the power of symbols. He needed to bury the past, not monumentalize it. He then systematically dismantled the world they had built. The Ptolemaic kingdom was annexed, becoming a Roman province. Egypt's vast grain reserves now fed Rome, not Antony's armies. Cleopatra's children were paraded in his triumph, and largely disappeared from the historical record, with the exception of Caesar Rion, Julius Caesar's son, who was executed on Augustus's orders. There would be no rival heir. The image of Antony was meticulously reshaped. The brave soldier, the charismatic leader, the loyal friend of Caesar, all these were erased. In their place, Augustus's propagandists, the poet Virgil among them, crafted a new Antony, the duped fool, the drunkard, the Roman man by Eastern decadence and a treacherous queen. His caricature would define Antony in the historical memory of the West for centuries. The love story was recast as a cautionary tale about the corruption of Roman virtue. Augustus, in contrast, was portrayed as the restorer of order, the pious defender of traditional values. He shut the doors of the Temple of Janus, declaring the civil wars over. He rebuilt temples, passed moral legislation, and presented himself as the father of a renewed, purified Rome. The Republic was not restored, as some had hoped. It was buried, and in its place stood the Principate, an imperial system with a republican facade. Augustus learned from the mistakes of his adoptive father, Julius Caesar. He avoided the title of king, instead accumulating powers under traditional titles, like princeps, first citizen and imperator commander. He mastered the art of ruling without seeming to rule. The Roman people, exhausted by decades of bloodshed, accepted the peace he offered, even at the cost of their liberty. Antony's legacy was not entirely extinguished, however. In the eastern provinces, where he had ruled and was often admired, his memory lingered. Some whispered that a true Roman, a soldier's soldier, had been defeated not by a bitter man, but by a colder, more cunning politician. For these were whispers, dangerous and faint. The official history, written by the victors, was clear. Mark Antony died not as a tragic hero, but as a warning. The storm of ambition, passion, and rivalry that had defined the fall of the Republic was finally stilled. In its place arose the long, stable, and autocratic peace of the Roman Empire. The age of giants like Caesar, Pompey, and Antony was over. The age of the emperor had begun. Augustus moved with cold efficiency to cement his victory and erase all rivals. He ordered the execution of Caesar Rion, Cleopatra's son, by Julius Caesar, eliminating any living symbol of a competing Julian bloodline. Antony's older sons by Fulvia were spared but paraded in his triumph, then largely vanished into obscurity. Cleopatra's other children with Antony, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, were taken to Rome and raised by Octavia, Antony's former wife, a masterstroke of political theatre that displayed both mercy and absolute dominance. The vast treasures of the Ptolemaic dynasty were seized, flooding the Roman economy with gold and allowing Augustus to pay every soldier his promised wages, securing the legion's permanent loyalty. He then formally annexed Egypt as a personal imperial province, governed by a prefect answerable only to him. No senator was even allowed to set foot there without his permission. This gave him control of the Mediterranean's breadbasket and a private treasury, making him financially untouchable. Back in Rome, he faced a Senate hollowed out by proscriptions and wars, its members eager for peace at any price. He staged a carefully choreographed performance of restoring the Republic, famously offering to resign his extraordinary powers. The Senate, thoroughly cowed and compliant, refused and begged him to stay, granting him the new name Augustus and a suite of permanent, Republican sounding titles Princeps, Imperator, Pontifex Maximus. He became not a king, but the first citizen, a subtle tyrant wearing the mask of a traditional magistrate. The Roman world, exhausted by a century of civil strife, accepted the mask willingly for the stability it brought. Augustus then launched a monumental propaganda, a campaign to permanent the blackened Antony's name and sanctify his own rule. Poets like Virgil and Horace, patronized by the regime, crafted a national myth where Antony was the effeminate, conquenor entitles, seduced and emasculated by the sinister Eastern queen. In this narrative, the war at Actium was not a civil war but a heroic defense of Roman Italy against the barbaric hordes of the East. Augustus was depicted as the champion of Apollo, the god of light and reason, against the chaotic, Dionysian forces embodied by Antony and Cleopatra. This dichotomy, West versus East, reason versus passion, manly virtue versus decadent, Epheminius became a cornerstone at August and ideology. Meanwhile, Augustus rebuilt Rome literally and figuratively. He claimed he found a city of brick and left it marble, funding vast construction projects like the Forum of Augustus, the Arapaces Altar of Peace, and the Temple of Mars Altar Mars the Avenger. Every building told a story of divine favor, ancestral piety, and military triumph, subtly reinforcing his new order. He reformed the military, creating a standing, professional army loyal to the emperor alone, and fixed its borders along natural frontiers like the Rhine and Danube. He established the Praetorian Guard, an elite military unit stationed in Rome, as his personal enforcer and a constant reminder of where ultimate power now resided. Socially, he passed laws promoting marriage and traditional morals, positioning himself as the restorer of ancient virtue, even as he presided over a profoundly transformed political reality. He cultivated an image of paternal care, managing the grain supply, establishing a fire brigade, and creating a rudimentary postal service. For the average Roman, life became more predictable, secure, and prosperous, which legitimized the loss of political freedom. The opposition was not eliminated but managed. Critical historians like Livy were allowed to write, praising the old republic in the past tense, while accepting the necessity of the present principate. Augustus' long reign, over 40 years, allowed this new system to become normalized, ingrained in the habits of an entire generation. When he died in 14 AD, the transfer of power to his steps Antibarus was smooth, establishing the precedent of dynastic succession. The Roman Republic was now a distant, romanticized memory. The empire, conceived in the ambitions of Caesar, born in the violence of the triumvirate, and delivered into mature autocracy by Augustus, would dominate the Western world for centuries. Mark Antony's true legacy, therefore, was not his own. It was his role as the essential foil, the catastrophic alternative against which Augustus could define himself. Antony's virtues, his raw courage, his legendary generosity, his capacity for deep loyalty and passion, were the very qualities that, in the Augustan narrative, proved his unfenced to rule. He was the last republican, a man whose instincts belonged to an older, more chaotic world of individual glory and personal allegiance. He failed because he could not, or would not, master the new politics of image, patience, and systemic control. His tragic romance with Cleopatra, while real and profound, provided the perfect moral and cultural fault line for Augustus to exploit. In the end, Antony's story is the closing chapter of one run. His defeat at Actium and his suicide in Alexandria marked the final, irrevocable death of the Republic. The lion was slain, not by a mightier beast, but by a colder, more calculating architect of a new world. Augustus spent the decades following Actium methodically transforming his military supremacy into a permanent, unchallengeable political system. He maintained the facade of republican institutions. The Senate still met, consuls were still elected, but all real power flowed from his person. This delicate balance of illusion and reality was his most brilliant creation. He established the Praetorian Guard, a permanent military force stationed in Rome, ensuring no rival could ever again use the capital's streets as a battlefield. He reformed the army into a professional, long-minus service for loyal to the emperor as paymaster, not to the Senate or abstract ideals of the Republic. The empire's borders were solidified, expansion slowed, replaced by a focus on consolidation, infrastructure, and defense. He initiated a vast building program across the empire, with roads, aqueducts, and monuments bearing his name, physically weaving his authority into the landscape. The altar of Peace Arapacis stood in Rome as a monumental symbol of the tranquility he claimed to have bestowed. He encouraged art and literature that celebrated the new age, with Virg a lesson aid providing a mythical foundation, linking Rome's destiny and the Julian family to divine will. Opposition was handled with a mixture of severity and theatrical clemency. Potential rivals were neutralized through exile or forced retirement, while public dissent was muted by prosperity and the potent memory of recent civil wars. He carefully managed his own public image, presenting himself not as a monarch but as a humble servant of the state, a mere first among equals. His performance was so convincing that when he died in AD 14, the mechanism of succession he had quietly prepared, the transfer of power to his steps Antiberius, operated smoothly. The Republic was not restored, it was permanently entombed beneath the architecture of the Principate. The Roman world, weary of chaos, accepted the trade political freedom for enduring peace. The Pax Romana. The legacy of Mark Antony was systematically dismantled and recast by the victorious Augustan regime. In official histories and poetry, Antony was no longer the charismatic general and Caesar's heir. He became a cautionary tale, a great Roman soul corrupted by Eastern decadence, enslaved by passion, and undone by a treacherous woman. His genuine virtues, loyalty, bravery, generosity, were twisted into vices, blind partisanship, reckless bravado, and wasteful extravagance. His love for Cleopatra was framed not as a complex political and personal partnership, but as a form of sorcery or madness, a symbol of his abandonment of Roman duty. His narrative served a crucial political purpose. It painted the final civil war not as a power struggle between Romans, but as a heroic defense of Western civilization against Oriental despotism. Augustus emerged not as a ruthless opportunist who destroyed a rival, but as the savior of traditional Roman values. The poetry of Horace and Virgil cemented this view for centuries. Meanwhile, Cleopatra was transformed into the ultimate foreign threat, a scheming seductress whose ambition was to subjugate Rome itself. Their twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, were taken to Rome and paraded in Augustus' triumph, living trophies of his victory. Antony's descendants were old or faded into obscurity, his bloodline extinguished as a political force. In the eastern provinces where Antony had been popular, his memory was more cautiously preserved, but under the watchful eye of Roman administration. His true historical tragedy lies in this posthumous transformation, the erasure of a multifaceted man and his replacement with a simplistic archetype of failure, used to legitimize the very imperial system he might have envisioned differently. The romance of Antony and Cleopatra has echoed through the centuries, often overshadowing the brutal political realities of their time. Their story has been relentlessly romanticized, transformed into a timeless tale of doomed love that transcends politics. In Shakespeare's version, they become titanic figures, their love so vast it consumes empires, and their deaths noble sacrifices to a world unworthy of their passion. This artistic interpretation prioritizes personal tragedy over historical analysis, turning Antony into a love-struck hero and Cleopatra into the embodiment of exotic allure. Modern historians strive to peel back these layers of myth, examining their alliance as a calculated political strategy. Cleopatra sought to preserve her kingdom's independence and restore Ptolemaic glory by allying with Rome's strongest man. Antony saw in Egypt and the East the resources and legitimacy needed to dominate the Roman world. Their relationship was likely a genuine blend of affection, mutual respect, and stark political necessity. The infamous donations of Alexandria, where Antony granted eastern territories to Cleopatra and her children, was less a lover's folly than a bold attempt to create a new Greco-Roman power structure with themselves at its center. It was a direct challenge to the Roman tradition of provincial government and a gift-wrapped propaganda victory for Octavian. The failure was not merely personal, but systemic. They underestimated the deep-seated Roman suspicion of Eastern monarchy and the relentless, patient ambition of Octavian. The love story, while compelling, was ultimately a component of a larger, failed political project. Their end was less a romantic suicide pact and more the inevitable conclusion of a lost war, with each choosing a death befitting their station, rather than suffer the humiliation of Octavia nest rhyme. The enduring fascination with this story testifies to its powerful blend of politics, passion, and epical change. The world that emerged from their defeat, the Augustan age, defined the future of Roman Western civilization. Augustus established a template for imperial rule that would last for over 200 years in the West and far longer in the East. He created a stable, centralized government that could administer a vast, diverse empire. The Pax Romana fostered unprecedented trade, cultural exchange, and relative security from Britain to Syria. This stability allowed Roman law, engineering, and the Latin language to take deep root, forming the bedrock of later European culture. The office of emperor, however, contained the seeds of future crises. The problem of succession often led to civil war, and the concentration of power could place the empire at the mercy of incompetent or tyrannical rulers. The republican ideals of shared governance and civic liberty were sacrificed for efficiency and order, a trade minus-off whose consequences would reverberate through Roman history. The poetic and artistic flourishing of the age, while serving as propaganda, also produced enduring masterpieces that shaped Western literature and art. The Augustan system proved robust enough to survive the madness of Caligula and Nero, demonstrating the deep institutional inertia he had engineered. By ending the civil wars, Augustus provided the platform for the Roman Empire's greatest achievements and its prolonged dominance. Yet, the shadow of how that peace was achieved through the calculated destruction of rivals like Antony, the end of political liberty, and the establishment of a disguised monarchy always lingered. The story of Antony and Cleopatra, therefore, marks the bloody, passionate, and tragic pivot between the chaotic liberty of the Republic and the imposed order of the Empire. Their demise was the necessary precondition for the world of emperors, legions, and imperial grandeur that followed, a world that would itself eventually crumble, but not before leaving an indelible stamp on history. Augustus's political settlement, though carefully disguised, established an imperial dynasty that would rule Rome for generations. He avoided the overt title of king, but through a combination of military command, control of the treasury, and manipulation of senatorial appointments, he rendered all other political institutions powerless. The Senate became a ceremonial body of wealthy supporters, its primary function to endorse the emperor's decisions and bestow honors upon him. The popular assemblies, once the theoretical source of power in the Republic, withered into irrelevance. Augustus's true innovation was the creation of a professional imperial bureaucracy, staffed by loyal equestrians and freedmen, which managed the day-to-day administration of the empire, independently of the old aristocratic families. This bureaucratic machine collected taxes, maintained roads, oversaw the grain supply, and administered justice, providing a continuity of government that transcended the life of any single emperor. The army was reformed into a permanent, standing force of legionaries who swore an oath of allegiance directly to the emperor, not to the Senate and people of Rome. Veterans were settled in colonies throughout the provinces, creating a network of loyal communities with a vested interest in the stability of the regime. Augustus also established the Praetorian Guard, an elite military unit stationed in Rome, which would later play a decisive and often destructive role in imperial succession crises. His reign saw the final pacification of Spain, the securing of the Rhine and Danube frontiers, and a failed attempt to conquer Germany, culminating in the devastating loss of 3 legions in the Teutoburg forest. This military setback led to a strategic shift from expansion to consolidation, defining the borders of the empire for centuries. Culturally, Augustus promoted a return to what he defined as traditional Roman values, enacting moral legislation to encourage marriage, childbearing, and religious piety. He restored dozens of temples and revived ancient priesthoods, positioning himself as the restorer of Rome's sacred covenant with the gods. This religious revival was deeply personal, as he encouraged the cult of his own genius, blurring the line between state religion and imperial veneration. The arts flourished under his patronage, but within clearly defined boundaries. Poets like Virgil, Horace, and Ovid celebrated the new age, though Ovid's subsequent exile demonstrated the limits of imperial tolerance. Augustus transformed the physical city of Rome, boasting he had found it brick and left it marble, with monumental projects like his own forum, the Arapaces, and the theatre of Marcellus reshaping the urban landscape in his image. This building program was not mere vanity, it was a powerful statement of permanent, unchallengeable order replacing the chaotic, competitive public building of the Republican nobility. He also initiated the first official map of the empire and comprehensive census, instruments of control that allowed the state to see and manage its resources and people with unprecedented clarity. The economic reforms he implemented, including a new system of taxation and the minting of standardized coinage, brought stability and fueled commerce across the Mediterranean. At the time of his death in AD 14, the system was so entrenched that the succession of his adopted son Tiberius, a man devoid of his stepfather's popular charm, proceeded without serious challenge. The Republic was not just dead, its memory had been successfully combed and usurped and sanitized, its forms preserved as hollow shells to legitimize a new kind of autocratic rule. The Augustan peace, the Pax Romana, was real. It brought an end to large minor-scale civil war for over 2 centuries, but it was a peace imposed from above, purchased at the cost of political freedom and reliant on the character of a single, all-minors powerful ruler. The historical demolition of Mark Antony was comprehensive and enduring. Augustan propaganda did not merely defeat him militarily, it annihilated his reputation and reprogrammed historical memory. The complex, robust Roman general was reduced to a simplistic caricature, the slave of a foreign queen, the dupe of his own appetites, a man who lost his Roman virtue in the perfumed halls of Alexandria. His narrative was disseminated through official histories, poetry, and public monuments. Virgil's Aeneid, while not maiming Antony directly, clearly contrasts the heroic duty Minos bound Aeneas to Minos and for Augustus with the passionate, destructive love of Dido echoing Cleopatra, framing Eastern entanglement as a tragic diversion from the destined path of Roman Empire. Horace's odes celebrated Actium as a victory of Roman gods over monstrous Egyptian deities. Even the architecture spoke. The temple of Apollo on the Palatine, vowed by Augustus before Actium, was built overlooking the site of Cleopatra's villa on the opposite bank of the Tiber, the permanent stone assertion of Roman order over Eastern decadence. Antony's political and military achievements, his vital role in Caesar's Gallic Wars, his administration of Italy during the Civil War, his initial popularity with both soldiers and the urban plebs were systematically erased or attributed to others. His genuine charismatic bond with his troops was recast as demagogic bribery. His grand strategic vision of a partnership between Rome and the Hellenistic East was portrayed as a betrayal of Roman destiny. His propagandistic version proved so successful that it dominated the historical record for nearly 2,000 years, preserved by later Roman historians like Plutarch and Cassius Dio, who relied on Augustan minus Eris sources. Only in modern times have historians begun to disentangle the man from the myth, analyzing him as a late Republican warlord operating within the brutal rules of his time, whose ultimate failure was less a moral failing and more a strategic miscalculation against a more adept political operator. His relationship with Cleopatra is now often assessed as a serious political alliance, a deliberate attempt to fuse Roman military power with Ptolemaic wealth and legitimacy to create a new imperial center of gravity. The domations of Alexandria, once proof of his doting folly, are analyzed as a pragmatic administrative reorganization of the Eastern client kingdoms under a stable, loyal dynasty. Yet, the romantic, tragic version of his story retains an undeniable power, ensuring his continued fascination long after the political details of the Second Triumvirate have faded from popular memory. Cleopatra VII, the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic kingdom, suffered an even more drastic posthumous reconstruction. To the Augustan regime, she was the ultimate other, a woman, a monarch, and an Eastern. She was depicted not as a head of state engaging in realpolitik, but as a monstrous fusion of Isis, Aphrodite, and a predatory serpent. Roman poets described her as a fatale monstrum, a fatal monster who aimed to enslave Rome and move the capital to Alexandria. Her intelligence, political acumen, and diplomatic skills, he was fluent in multiple languages and authored works on medicine and alchemy, were ignored or twisted into signs of sinister culling. Her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were painted not as successive alliances with the most powerful Romans as the aid to secure her throne and her kingdom's interests, but as serial seductions designed to fulfill a personal ambition for world domination. The image of her death by frostbite, whether true or not, was perfect for Roman propaganda. It was exotic, theatrical, and fittingly effeminate, a final melodramatic act by a creature of passion. This Oriental's caricature served to justify Augustus' conquest of Egypt as a righteous act of liberation from a tyrannical seductors. Beneath the myth, however, was a ruler of exceptional ability, fighting a desperate war-god action to preserve her kingdom's independence. She stabilized Egypt's economy, navigated the lethal politics of the late Roman Republic with remarkable skill, and nearly succeeded in placing her children as the heirs to a vast Romano-Egyptian realm. Her failure was the failure of Ptolemaic Egypt itself against the overwhelming, centralized might of the rising Roman Empire. The annexation of Egypt as a personal imperial province ended nearly 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule and transformed the Mediterranean balance of power, providing Rome with an inexhaustible grandeur treasury. Cleopatra's story, like Antony's, is a tale of the last stand of a dying world order against an inexorable new one, a narrative forever complicated by the gendered and cultural biases of the sources that recorded her defeat. The long-term consequences of Actium and the fall of Antony and Cleopatra were nothing less than the reign-inus founding of Roman civilization. The Augustan system created the stable platform for the Roman Empire's golden age in the 2nd century AD. The Pax Romana enabled trade networks to stretch from Scotland to Somalia, allowed for the spread of mystery cults and philosophical ideas, and standardized land administration across 3 continents. Latin and Greek became the lingua francas of the West and East, respectively, shaping the development of European and Near Eastern languages. Ran and engineering aqueducts, roads, bridges, and harbors knit the empire together and set a technological standard that would not be surpassed for over a millennium. This era also saw the birth of Christianity within the Roman world, a religion that would eventually be adopted by the empire itself, transforming European culture. However, the imperial system also contained fatal flaws. The problem of succession, never legally or clearly solved, led to repeated civil wars, military usurpations, and the chaotic year of the 4 emperors in AD 16. The concentration of power made the empire vulnerable to the caprices of bad emperors like Caligula, Nero, and Commodus. The cost of maintaining the vast army and bureaucracy placed an immense tax burden on the provinces and led to economic stagnation and inflation over time. The very stability Augustus created bred complacency. The Roman legions, once innovators, gradually lost their tactical edge against evolving external threats on the frontiers. The static, defensive posture adopted after Augustus eventually proved unsustainable. Furthermore, the extinction of political liberty and civic participation at the center may have contributed to a long-term decline in the political vitality and moral resilience of the Roman elite. In the end, the story that began with the rivalry of Antony and Octavian is the story of Rome's transformation from a dynamic, unstable, and violent republic into a majestic, stable, and rigid empire. It was a trade whose benefits, centuries of relative peace and unparalleled cultural integration, came with a long-term cost that would only become fully apparent as the empire faced crisis after crisis in the centuries to come. The ghosts of Antony and Cleopatra thus haunt, not just as lovers, but as symbols of the path not taken, a reminder of the chaotic, pluralistic, and dangerously free world that was extinguished to build the monumental, ordered, and autocratic edifice of imperial Rome. The transition from republic to empire under Augustus established a governmental template that would dominate Western political thought for millennia, enshrining the concept of a single sovereign ruler as the necessary guarantor of order and peace. This model of centralized authority, balancing military control, bureaucratic administration, and ideological propaganda, became the archetype for subsequent empires, from the Byzantine and Holy Roman to the early modern absolutist states of Europe. The Roman imperial system demonstrated that vast, Multicultural territories could be unified under a single land, a shared infrastructure. The lesson not lost on later conquerors and administrators. However, the system also institutionalized a critical vulnerability. The state's health became perilously linked to the character and competence of one individual. The Julio-Claudian dynasty that followed Augustus showcased this flaw dramatically, veering from the capable administration of Tiberius and Claudius to the tyrannical extravagance of Caligula and Nero. Each succession was a potential crisis, resolved by a combination of palace intrigue, Praetorian Guard interference, and aristocratic maneuvering, proving that Augustus had solved the problem of civil war only temporarily, not permanently. The year of the four emperors, sixtiency, Nade Starkey revealed that the secret of empire was that an emperor could be made elsewhere than in Rome, a precedent that would lead to the perpetual militarization of politics in the 3rd century. Furthermore, the economic foundations laid by Augustus, while creating initial prosperity, relied heavily on continuous territorial expansion and plunder. Once expansion halted, the empire faced systemic issues of revenue, leading to debasement of currency, crippling taxation, and the gradual decline of the urban middle class. The social legislation intended to revive traditional morals often proved hollow, unable to stem changing attitudes towards family, religion, and personal identity, and occasionally creating new forms of corruption and evasion. The Augustan cultural renaissance, though producing masterpieces, also set a precedent for state patronage of the arts as a tool for ideological control, the practice mirrored in countless regimes since. The very peace he established, the Pax Romana, while a golden age for literature and trade, may have dulled the martial and republican virtues he claimed to champion, creating a population more interested in bread and circuses than in civic participation. Thus, the legacy of the Augustan settlement is profoundly ambiguous. It provided the stability necessary for classical civilization to reach its zenith and spread its influence, and it also embedded structural weaknesses, political, military, and economic, that would contribute to centuries of crisis and eventual transformation. The world shaped by Augustus's victory over Antony was thus a world of magnificent order built upon a foundation of extinguished liberty, a trade minus off whose consequences define the arc of Roman history from the 1st century BC to the fall of the Western Empire. The posthumous monologuizing of Antony and Cleopatra served not only to justify the new regime, but also to create a powerful and enduring cultural archetype, the dangerous, all-consuming romantic love that stands in opposition to duty and reason. This archetype has been tirelessly recycled in Western art, literature, and drama, from Shakespeare's profound tragedy to Hollywood epics, and these retellings, the specific political context of the Roman civil wars fades, and the story becomes a universal metaphor for the conflict between the heart and the state, between personal desire and public responsibility. Antony is recast as the archetypal warrior, Ninus poet, a man of action and feeling brought low by a passion greater than himself. Cleopatra becomes the ultimate femme fatale, a symbol of exotic wisdom and sensual power, but also of treacherous enchantment. This reinterpretation, while historically reductive, speaks to a perennial human fascination with figures who choose love over power, or who are destroyed by the union of the two. It allows each age to project its own anxieties about gender, authority, and the East onto the story. The Victorian era, for instance, saw Cleopatra as a morally decadent temptress, while some modern feminist readings reclaim her as a shrewd political leader maligned by patriarchal historians. The fascination endures because their story operates on multiple levels. It is a high-stakes political thriller, a timeless romance, and a cosmic tragedy about the end of an era. Their demise symbolizes the moment the freewheeling, individualistic, and cosmopolitan Hellenistic world was finally undecisively absorbed into the rigid, legalistic, and centralized Roman system. They were the last rulers to challenge Rome on something like equal terms, and their failure marked the point of no return for the Mediterranean-esque political unification under a single imperial capital. Every retelling of their story, therefore, whether seeking historical truth or poetic resonance, grapples with this pivotal moment of historical transition. examining the aftermath for their children and allies completes the picture of august and ruthlessness and realpolitik. Caesarion, Julius Caesar's biological son, was killed on Octavian's orders. A logical step to eliminate a potent rival symbol. Antony's children by Cleopatra, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus were paraded in Augustus' triumph in Rome, their chains reportedly so heavy they could not walk. This brutal humiliation was a calculated spectacle of conquest. Afterwards, they were given to Octavia, Antony's former wife, to be raised, a move of exquisite psychological cruelty and political theatre, displaying both clementia mercy and absolute dominance. Cleopatra Selene was later married to Jubai I, the scholarly client king of Mauritania, where she seems to have exercised significant power, fostering a mini-Alexandrian court in Tisserien, adding coins minted in her own name. Her brothers, however, vanished from history, likely dead from illness, or discreetly eliminated. Antony's older sons by Fulvia, Iullus Antonius and Antonia, were integrated into the imperial family, but remained under a cloud of suspicion. Iullus was later executed for alleged adultery with Augustus' daughter Julia. Antony's surviving daughter by Octavia, Antonia Minor, became a revered matriarch of the imperial family, mother to the future emperor Claudius and grandmother to Caligula. Thus, Antony's bloodline flowed into the Julio-Claudian dynasty itself. A quiet irony beneath the official narrative of his disgrace. His partisans and supporters were largely pardoned in a general amnesty after Actium, a practical move to reconcile the eastern provinces and stabilize the empire. Many of his former legions were seamlessly incorporated into the new imperial army, their loyalties transferred with their pay. This systematic neutralization of his legacy, physical, political, and genealogical, demonstrates the comprehensive nature of Augustus' victory. It was not enough to win the war. Every remnant of the opposing order had to be assimilated, neutralized, or erased to prevent a future rallying point. The quiet fate of Cleopatra Selene in Mauritania is perhaps the most poignant postscript, a fragment of the Ptolemaic-Egyptian visions, surviving and even flourishing on the empire's periphery, a small, resilient shoot from a tree whose main trunk had been felled. The ultimate historical significance of this period lies in its definitive resolution of the crisis of the Roman Republic. For nearly a century, the republican system had been straining under the weight of empire, unable to manage the armies, wealth, and social tensions its own success had created. The Gracchi, Marius, Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar had each, in turn, broken its norms in a cycle of escalating violence. The conflict between Antony and Octavian was the final, decisive iteration of this struggle. Antony represented, in many ways, the older model, a military dynasty seeking personal preeminence within a loose oligarchic framework, comfortable with sharing power in a triumvirate and building a personal following based on patronage and charisma. His alliance with Cleopatra and his focus on the East can be seen as an attempt to create a new imperial center that was not exclusively Roman but Greco-Roman, a synthesis of Mediterranean cultures. Octavian, in contrast, pioneered a new model, the creation of a monolithic, bureaucratic state headed by a single princeps, where power was centralized and institutionalized rather than personal, and where ideology was carefully managed to serve the regime. His victory meant the future would belong to the state-builder, not the warlord, to the administrator, not the adventurer. It cemented Latin as the language of Western administration and law, and it bound the fate of the West to a single, centralized political structure for centuries. The Republic's death gave birth to the classical idea of universal empire, the concept that would later be inherited by the Christian Church in medieval kingdoms. In the East, the Roman Empire evolved into the Byzantine Empire, preserving Roman law and administration for another 1,000 years in Greek guise. Thus, the story that culminates at Actium and Alexandria is not merely a personal tragedy or a political upheaval. It is one of the most consequential turning points in world history, marking the end of the ancient Mediterranean's multipolar political world and the beginning of its unification under a system whose echoes would shape European history until the rise of the modern nation-state. Augustus solidified his power by establishing a professional standing army whose primary loyalty was to the emperor's commander-in-chief rather than to the abstract concept of the Roman state. He systematically dismantled the client armies of rival magnates, ensuring no private individual could again command the military resources to challenge the throne. The immense wealth seized from Egypt provided the initial capital to fund veteran settlements, public works, and the regular donatives that kept the legions content. He created the Praetorian Guard, the elite military unit permanently stationed in Italy, as both a personal bodyguard and a stark deterrent against senatorial conspiracy. The borders of the empire were aggressively expanded in his early reign, then fixed and fortified after the disaster in the Teutoburg forest, shifting imperial policy from conquest to defensive consolidation. A vast network of all-weather roads was constructed or improved, facilitating the rapid movement of troops, imperial couriers, and commercial goods across provinces. He established the Aerarian Militare, a dedicated military treasury funded by new taxes, to provide pensions for veterans, thereby removing a primary cause of late Republican unrest. The Senate was reformed and purged. Its membership expanded to include loyalists from Italy and the provinces, transforming it from a governing body into a council of prestigious imperial administrators. He cultivated a public image of piety, restoring 80 miners to temples in Rome and reviving archaic religious rituals to portray his rule as a divine restoration of traditional order. And moral legislation known as the Lex Julia sought to promote marriage, childbearing, and marital fidelity, though its success was limited and it was oft uncircumvented by the elite. A census of the entire empire was undertaken, the first of its kind, to assess population and wealth for more efficient taxation and military recruitment. He initiated an ambitious building program, boasting he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble, with his own forum, altars, and theatres dominating the urban landscape. The arts were patronized but carefully directed, with poets like Virgil and Horace composing works that celebrated the new age and subtly legitimized the regime. Potential rivals within the family, like his grandson Agrippa Postumus, were exiled or executed to ensure a clear and unchallenged succession for his chosen heir, Tiberius. He developed an efficient imperial bureaucracy staffed by equestrians and freedmen, bypassing the senatorial aristocracy and creating a centralized administrative state. The title Prince's first citizen was deliberately chosen to evoke republican ideals while masking the reality of his autocratic power, a masterpiece of political branding. He divided the provinces into imperial provinces, governed by his own legates, and senatorial provinces, a concession that preserved senatorial dignity without real authority. The Pax Romana he established was not merely an absence of war but an active program of legal standardization, economic integration, and cultural Romanization. His personal life was carefully staged, projecting an image of modest frugality in his household despite the unimaginable wealth at his disposal. He avoided the overt trappings of monarchy, refusing perpetual consulships and sometimes appearing as a mere citizen in public forums to maintain the republican facade. The system of imperial succession remained deliberately vague, based on familial adoption and the grant of tribunician power, which would become a recurring source of instability. He neutralized the power of popular assemblies by transferring their electoral functions to the Senate, which now simply ratified lists he had pre-minus approved. The extensive grained olls and public gains were used to secure the loyalty of the urban plebs, a policy of bread and circuses that became a staple of imperial rule. He fostered a cult of his own genius, the divine spirit of the household, which evolved into a state-sanctioned form of emperor worship, particularly in the provinces. The conquest and absorption of Egypt transformed the Roman economy, providing a vast, fertile granary and a direct maritime route for eastern trade and luxuries. He commissioned a comprehensive map of the empire and an official list of its resources, demonstrating a desire for total knowledge and control of his domains. The social order was rigidly enforced, with laws reinforcing the authority of fathers over families and patrons over clients, seeking to restore a hierarchical stability. His long reign of over 40 years allowed these reforms and institutions to become deeply ingrained, normalizing the imperial system for a generation. The ambiguity of his constitutional position, a monarch in all but name, created a template that could accommodate both strong and weak emperors, for better or worse. His death in AD 14 was followed by a smooth succession to Tiberius, proving the system could survive its founder, though the underlying tensions were merely dormant. The august settlement ultimately traded the chaotic liberty and competitive violence of the late Republic for a stable, authoritarian peace that would define the next 3 centuries. The myth of the restored Republic was so convincing that many contemporaries genuinely believed the old forms had been preserved, a testament to his political artistry. His legacy is a paradox: the founder of an imperial system that brought prolonged stability and cultural flourishing, yet also the grave-digger of a political tradition of shared civic power. The world after Augustus was fundamentally different, its politics internal to the imperial court, rather than played out in the open fronts and battlefields of the Republic. This transformation rendered the Roman state more resilient to external threats, but more vulnerable to the whims and pathologies of a single ruler. The administrative machinery he built would sustain the empire through crises and incompetent emperors, proving more durable than any individual who sat upon the throne. The ideological framework he established of peace, prosperity, and piety restored became the benchmark against which all future Roman emperors were measured. His victory over Antony and Cleopatra was thus not merely the end of a civil war, but the decisive birth of a new world order whose structures shaped the destiny of Europe, North Africa, and the Near East for centuries to come. The Julian-Claudian dynasty that followed Augustus exposed both the strengths and fatal weaknesses of the new imperial system, demonstrating how quickly the carefully constructed facade of the prince opaque could fray under the pressure of personal vice, paranoia, and familial intrigue. Tiberius, a capable administrator, but a reluctant and increasingly reclusive emperor, retreated to the island of Capri, leaving governance in the hands of the ambitious and ruthless Praetorian prefect Ianus, whose machinations led to a reign of terror in Rome and the destruction of many senatorial families. The reign of Caligula began with great popularity, but swiftly descended into what ancient sources described as megalomaniacal madness, featuring grandiose building projects, the humiliation of the Senate, the treatment of his horse as a consul, and a dangerous flirtation with Hellenistic divine kingship, culminating in his assassination by his own guards. Claudius, underestimated as a scholar and cripple, proved an energetic and effective ruler, personally overseeing the conquest of Britain, expanding the imperial bureaucracy with freedmen, and improving legal and administrative systems. Yet his reign was poisoned by the powerful and manipulative influence of his wives, Messalina and Agrippina the Younger. Nero, the last of the line, began under the guidance of his tutor Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, inaugurating a period of artistic patronage and diplomatic success. But his later years were unarced by the Great Fire of Rome, the brutal persecution of Christians as scapegoats, the murder of his mother Agrippina, an extravagant artistic self, minus indulgence, that alienated the aristocracy and military, leading to widespread rebellion and his eventual suicide. The year of the 4 emperors sixtensi, AD that followed Nero's death, brutally confirmed the secret that Augustus had tried to obscure, that emperors were made by the loyalty of the legions, not by senatorial decree or dynastic inheritance, plunging the empire into its first major civil war since Actium. Vespasian, the eventual victor, founded the Flavian dynasty and restored stability through fiscal austerity. Massive building projects like the Colosseum had a deliberate policy of emphasizing his humble, provincial origins as a contrast to Julia-Claudian decadence. The succession of his son Titus, brief and marked by disaster like the eruption of Vesuvius, and then his other son Domitian, who ruled as an autocratic and suspicious master, revealed the continuing instability of hereditary succession. The period of the 5 good emperors Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antony and Spius, Marcus Aurelius that followed from 96 to 180 AD represented the absolute zenith of the Pax Romana, characterized by adoptive succession, choosing the best man rather than a biological son, territorial expansion to its greatest extent under Trajan, intelligent consolidation under Hadrian, profound philosophical rule under Marcus Aurelius, and overall competent, centralized administration. However, even this golden age was marred by constant frontier wars. The beginning of the Marco-Mannic Wars on the Danube, and the ominous reign of Marcus Aurelius' biological son, Commodus, whose disastrous rule as a gladiator-emperor plunged the empire back into chaos and heralded the crises of the 3rd century. The structural flaw of personal rule was laid bare in the 3rd century, when a rapid succession of barracks emperors, most rising from the army and dying by violent overthrow, combined with massive foreign invasions, economic collapse, and regional fragmentation, merely destroyed the empire. It was only saved by ruthless military dictators like Aurelian and finally by Diocletian, who, merely 3 centuries after Augustus, formally abandoned the republican disguise and reorganized the state into an overt, bureaucratic, and rigid autocracy, the dominate proving that the Augustan system, for all its genius, was ultimately a transitional phase to a more openly despotic form of rule. Thus, a system born from Augustus' victory evolved, mutated, and ultimately revealed its inherent contradictions, demonstrating that the peace of Rome was forever purchased at the price of liberty and was perpetually vulnerable to the character of the man who wore the purple. The reverberations of the Roman imperial model extended far beyond antiquity, fundamentally shaping the political imagination of medieval and early modern Europe. The very concept of a translatio imperii, the transfer of empire, provided a continuous thread of ideological legitimacy from Rome to its successors. Charlemagne's coronation as Holy Roman Emperor in 800 AD was a conscious attempt to resurrect the Western Roman Empire in partnership with the papacy, blending Roman imperial authority with Christian theology. The Byzantine Empire, with its capital at Constantinople, maintained an unbroken line of Roman law, administration, and imperial ceremony for a millennium after the fall of the West, styling itself simply as Romania. In Western Europe, the shadow of Rome loomed over every would-be universal ruler, the Holy Roman Emperors, the Ottoman sultans who claimed the title Caesar after conquering Constantinople, and even the Russians, as a title derived from Caesar, all sought to cloak themselves in the mantle of Roman authority. The administrative techniques pioneered by Augustus standardized law codes, census-staking, provincial governance, and state-funded public works became the aspirational template for nascent monarchies. Roman law, codified under Justinian, formed the bedrock of continental European legal systems. The Latin language, spread by Roman administration and the later Catholic Church, provided the linguistic and intellectual foundation for Western scholarship, diplomacy, and science for over 1,000 years. The architectural and engineering legacy in roads, aqueducts, monumental arches, and concrete construction set a standard that would not be surpassed until the Renaissance and Industrial Revolution. The very geography of Europe was shaped by Roman cities, many of which London, Paris, Vienna, Cologne remained major population centers. The idea of a unified, cosmopolitan world-state governed by a single rational law, as realized under the Pax Romana, became a powerful, recurring dream for philosophers and statesmen. From Dante's vision of a universal monarchy to the Enlightenment concepts of cosmopolitanism and later attempts at European unification. Conversely, the fall of Rome became the West's primary historical parable about the fragility of civilization, sparking endless analysis about the causes of decadence, the importance of military virtue, and the dangers of internal division. The Roman Empire's dual legacy as a model of sublime order and a warning of catastrophic collapse has thus been a constant and shaping force in the history of the West. Its ghost implicitly present in every project of imperial ambition, legal codification, or civilization self-assessment. The historical memory of figures like Antony and Cleopatra has been perpetually rewritten to serve the needs of the present, revealing more about the eras that reinterpret them than about the ancient world itself. In the Middle Ages, they were often moralized as exemplars of lust and worldly pride in cautionary tales. The Renaissance, rediscovering classical texts, viewed them with a more nuanced, humanist fascination, captivated by their political magnitude and tragic ends. Shakespeare's Elizabethan Minnesota portrayal synthesized these strands, presenting Antony as a colossus of passion tragically divided between Roman duty and Egyptian allure, and Cleopatra as infinite in her variety, the queen whose theatrical suicide crowned her with immortal fame. The Romantic era of the 19th century embraced them as ultimate icons of passionate, doomed love, overshadowing the political dimensions of their story. Victorian England, with its imperial anxieties and strict moral codes, often depicted Cleopatra as a dangerously sensual Oriental despot, a warning against the corrupting influence of the East upon Western man. The 20th century, with the rise of psychoanalysis, saw interpretations focusing on Antony's supposed emasculation and Cleopatra's predatory sexuality. Modern scholarship, aided by archaeology and a more critical approach to ancient sources, has striven to recover their political agency, analyzing Cleopatra as a shrewd Hellenistic monarch and Antony as a traditional Roman commander navigating a shattered political landscape. Cinema, from the silent era to the 1963 epic starring Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, has consistently emphasized spectacle and romance, solidifying their iconic status in popular culture. This endless adaptability of their story underscores its archetypal power. It is a canvas onto which societies project their deepest anxieties about gender, power, imperialism, cultural identity, and the conflict between reason and emotion. They remain eternally relevant because their story encapsulates the moment when the personal and the political collide on a world-minus historical scale, when love and ambition become indistinguishable, and when the choices of two individuals can symbolize the turning of an age. Their final refuge and suicide in Alexandria marked not just an end, but a beginning of their second life as immortal symbols, forever oscillating between the poles of history and myth. He strategically appointed legates from the equestrian order or his own family to command legions, breaking the old aristocratic monopoly on military glory and ensuring commanders owed their careers solely to imperial favor. A network of fortified camps, watches, and patrol roads was constructed along the Rhine, Danube, and Euphrates frontiers, institutionalizing aesthetic, defensive posture that would characterize imperial strategy for centuries. The Roman navy was formally organized into permanent fleets based at Misenum and Ravenna, clearing the Mediterranean of piracy and securing the vital grain shipments from Egypt and Africa. He established the Vigiles, a permanent firefighting and night-watch police force for Rome, addressing urban disorder and providing another avenue for imperial patronage and control within the city. The Senate was purged and expanded to around 1,000 members, filled with loyalists from Italy and the provincial aristocracy, who owed their status and wealth to the emperor, transforming it into a supportive council of state. The traditional magistracy as consul, praetor, aedile were preserved but stripped of real power, becoming prestigious honors in a cursus honor, and that now led to service in the imperial bureaucracy rather than independent authority. He divided the provinces into two classes: imperial provinces, which housed the legions and were governed by his personally appointed legates, and senatorial provinces, which were considered pacified and governed by ex-mons magistrates, a clever division of administrative labor that kept military power firmly in his hands. The imperial provinces, especially the wealthy ones like Syria and soon Egypt, became the true centers of power and revenue, while the Senate administered less crucial territories. He created the position of Pay or Effect Asabi, a permanent senatorial prefect for Rome, to maintain order in the capital, further eroding the traditional roles of the consuls and other republican magistrates. The cursus publicus, an official state-run courier and transportation service with relay stations along lane roads, was established to accelerate official communications and tighten administrative control over distant provinces. He initiated the first comprehensive census of the entire empire, a monumental bureaucratic undertaking to assess population and property for taxation and military recruitment, demonstrating the state's newfound capacity to intrude into the lives of its subjects. A new gold and silver coinage, the Orcent denarius, was issued with high purity, stabilizing currency across the empire and facilitating trade and tax collection, though later emperors would debase it to fund deficits. Major public works projects, roads like the Via Augusta in Hispania, aqueducts like the Aqua Julia in Rome, and monumental buildings were funded by the imperial treasury, employing thousands, improving infrastructure, and visibly imprinting his name on the landscape. He heavily patronized a circle of poets, historians, and artists who, in turn, crafted a lasting mythology of his reign. Verge a lesson Eid linked Rome's destiny to the Julian line, Pharis's odes celebrated the new peace, and Livius' history mourned the lost republic, while accepting the necessity of the Principate. The Arapaces Auguste a altar at Augustan peace, adorned with reliefs depicting the imperial family and allegories of peace and prosperity, served as a powerful piece of visual propaganda in the heart of Rome. He revived ancient religious festivals and priestly colleges, and as Pontifex Maximus, he tightly controlled state religion, using it to promote traditional values and associate his rule with divine favor and cosmic order. A subtle but pervasive cult of the emperor's genius guiding spirit was encouraged, particularly in the provinces, laying the groundwork for the full-blown imperial cult that would become a key to love provincial loyalty. Moral legislation. The leges Julia attempted to penalize adultery, encourage marriage and procreation among the upper classes, and limit extravagant spending, though its enforcement was uneven and often resisted. He used his tribunici and power, renewed annually, to pose as the permanent protector of the common people, vetoing legislation and proposing laws while being immune from legal prosecution himself. His personal control of the state finances, through the imperial fiscus treasury separate from the old-era Rum Saturnii, gave him an economic power no senator could match, funding armies and projects without senatorial approval. He carefully managed his own public image, appearing in simple Roman dress, living in a relatively modest house on the Palatine, and performing the gestures of a civilian magistrate to contrast with the perceived oriental monarchy of Antony and Cleopatra. The title Augustus, meaning revered or majestic, was conferred upon him, a term with religious connotations but no specific republican office, perfectly encapsulating his supraminus constitutional authority. He systematically identified and promoted talented administrators regardless of birth, like Agricola and Maecenas, creating a new ruling elite whose loyalty was personal and direct. The annexation of Egypt as his personal imperial province provided a colossal, continuous source of grain, money, and exotic prestige, making the emperor the literal feeder of Rome and its plebs. He navigated multiple potential succession crises, first favoring his nephew Marcellus, then his friend Agrippa, and finally he steps on Tiberius, revealing the inherent instability of a system reliant on familial inheritance in an era of high mortality. For failure of his preferred heirs, Gaius and Lucius Caesar, easing him, forced a final, reluctant adoption of Tiberius, demonstrating that even the most meticulous planning could not control fate. He presented his constitutional reforms not as innovation, but as restoration, a return to the mos meum custom of the ancestors after a period of chaos, a brilliant rhetorical move that disarmed conservative opposition. The Pax Romana he established was, in effect, a Roman monopoly on large minor-scale violence within the Mediterranean world, allowing for unprecedented movement of people, goods, and ideas. This peace, however, was maintained by constant loam, honest level warfare on the frontiers and the silent, omnipresent threat of force against any internal dissent. His reign created a template for imperial rule that balanced coercion with consensus, military power with cultural patronage, and autocratic control with the forms of republican liberty. The system proved robust enough to survive the ineptitude of Caligula, the artistic tyranny of Nero, and the civil war of 16 AD, a testament to the deep institutional foundations he had laid. The Principate ultimately solved the immediate crisis of the late Republic by centralizing power, but it transferred the locus of political conflict from the Forum to the Imperial Palace, where plots were hatched in secrecy and resolved by betrayal or assassination. His legacy is Janus Minus Faced, the architect of a stable, prosperous, and enduring world empire, and the man who permanently extinguished the Roman Republic's experiment in shared, participatory governance. The world after Augustus was one where liberty was redefined as security under law provided by a benevolent father figure, and where the citizen's role shifted from active participant to passive beneficiary of the imperial order. This transformation shaped the political imagination of Europe for 2 millennia, making the model of centralized imperial authority the default ideal for state-minus building until the modern era. The Augustan system, despite its stability, inherently concentrated the fatal risks of succession within the opaque walls of the imperial family and the barracks of the Praetorian Guard. Tiberius, his successor, inherited a functioning administrative machine but lacked Augustus's popular touch, his reign gradually descending into paranoia and the terror of treasonous rivals. The dynasty founded by Augustus would produce both capable administrators like Claudius, who expanded the bureaucracy and conquered Britain, and monstrous tyrants like Nero. His extravagance and persecution of Christians would become legendary. The year of the four emperors 16 AD brutally exposed the foundational truth Augustus had tried to mask that imperial power was ultimately sought from the loyalty of the legions, not the Senate or people of Rome. The Flavian dynasty that emerged from the civil war, founded by Vespasian, openly acknowledged the military basis of power, consolidating control and financing monumental projects like the Colosseum with the spoils from Judea. The 5 good emperors of the 2nd century AD, who practiced adoptive succession, represented the system's ideal form, capable rulers chosen from merit, presiding over the empire's territorial and economic zenith. This period of prosperity and relative peace, however, masked the gradual sclerosis of the Roman economy, the growing strain of frontier defense, and the slow decline of the autonomous civic life that had characterized the Republic. The Severan dynasty in the 3rd century further militarized the state, raising soldiers' pay, privileging the army above all other institutions, and essentially turning the empire into a military dictatorship funded by relentless taxation. A crisis of the 3rd century A50-year period of civil war, barbarian invasions, and economic collapse proved the Augustan system could break down entirely when faced with simultaneous external pressures and the failure of central authority. Diocletian's reforms in the late 3rd century attempted to save the empire by dismantling the last illusions of the Principate, formally dividing power between multiple emperors and instituting a rigid, top-down bureaucratic and economic system. Constantine's conversion to Christianity and foundation of Constantinople completed the transformation, shifting the empire's ideological and geographical center of gravity to the Greek East. The Western Roman Empire eventually succumbed to a combination of internal weakness and external pressure, its last emperor deposed in 476 AD, while the Eastern Byzantine Empire endured for another 1,000 years. Thus, the system Augustus created demonstrated a remarkable durability, yet its very structure centralized, personal, and military minus-based contained the seeds of its long-minus-term instability and eventual fragmentation. The republican ideals of senatorial deliberation and civic virtue were never wholly forgotten, resurfacing as nostalgic ideals in later Roman writers and inspiring political thinkers during the Renaissance and Enlightenment. Augustus's own carefully crafted image endured on coins, statues, and in the pages of historians, ensuring he would be remembered as the wise founder rather than the ruthless victor of civil war. The myth of the Pax Augusta became a potent political metaphor for later rulers, seeking to legitimize their own authority by promising an end to chaos and a return to golden minus age order. The administrative geography, he solidified the provinces. The road networks, the urban centers formed the enduring skeleton of European and Mediterranean political organization for centuries. The legal framework developed under the Principate, later codified under Justinian, became the bedrock of Western legal tradition, transmitting Roman concepts of property, contract, and justice to the modern world. The story of Antony and Cleopatra, refracted through Augustan propaganda and later romanticization, entered the Western canon as the archetypal narrative of love versus duty, passion versus reason, and the exotic East versus the rational West. Archaeology continues to reveal the physical scale of his reign, from the ruins of cities and aqueducts to the very plan of Rome itself, which still follows the outlines of his monumental building projects. Modern historians continually debate his legacy, weighing the benefits of imposed peace and cultural efflorescence against the costs of autocracy and the death of republican liberty. His life stands as a definitive case study in the seizure, consolidation, and systematization of power, a masterclass in political strategy that remains relevant to the study of statecraft. Ultimately, the world Augustus built was a grand, complex, and contradictory edifice, a vehicle for unprecedented human achievement and integration, yet also a structure whose inherent tensions would fuel cycles of crisis and renewal until its final transformation. The Julia-Claudian dynasty, established by Augustus, would rule Rome for nearly a century, oscillating between competent administration and terrifying decadence, proving the system's resilience but also its vulnerability to the character of a single ruler. Tiberius, despite initial capability, retreated to Capri, allowing the rise of the sinister Praetorian prefect, Veianus, a climate of fear defined by treason, wiles, and deal to raise informers. Caligula's brief reign exposed the absurd dangers of unhinged autocracy as he squandered the treasury, demanded divine honors, and terrorized the elite, only to be assassinated by his own guards. Claudius, underestimated and initially proclaimed by the Praetorians, proved an able administrator, overseeing the conquest of Britain, expanding the imperial bureaucracy with freedmen, and improving legal and civic infrastructure. Nero, the last of the line, began under good counsel, but descended into artistic megalomania, scapegoating Christians for the Great Fire of Rome, and ultimately facing revolts that led to his suicide and the end of the dynasty. The Civil War of 16 AD, the year of the four emperors, brutally validated Tacitus's observation that the secret of empire was now revealed. An emperor could be made elsewhere than in Rome, as rival generals Galba, Athode, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian fought for the throne with their legions. Vespasian's triumph established the Flavian dynasty, restoring fiscal and military discipline, crushing the Jewish revolt, and using its spoils to begin the Colosseum, a monument to popular entertainment funded by conquest. His sons, Titus and Domitian, completed the transition, Titus as the benevolent short-reigned emperor, and Domitian as the efficient but paranoid autocrat. His assassination marked the end of Flavian rule, the subsequent era of the five good emperors Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antony, and Pius. Marcus Aurelius saw the system function at its best, with adoptive succession selecting mature, capable rulers who expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent under Trajan, then consolidated it under Hadrian's walls and administrative reforms. This period, the Pax Romana at its height, was characterized by monumental architecture, flourishing trade, and a cosmopolitan blending of cultures. Yet it also relied on the relentless exploitation of slave labor and provincial resources. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher minus emperor, spent much of his reign fighting defensive wars on the Danube frontier, his meditations reflecting the stoic acceptance of duty amid perpetual crisis, and his choice of his incompetent son Commodus as heir broke the adoptive succession, plunging Rome back into dynastic failure. Commodus's reign of gladiatorial vanity and misrule directly triggered the chaotic and violent Everan period, where military prowess and pay became the sole basis of imperial legitimacy, setting the stage for the third-century crises. The Severan emperors, particularly Septimus Severus and his son Caracalla, openly favored the army, raising soldiers, pay, granting legal privileges, and telling his sons to enrich the soldiers and scorn all others, a policy that fatally unbalanced the state's finances. Caracalla's edict of 212 AD, granting Roman citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire, was an official move to expand the tax base, that it also diluted the meaning of citizenship and erased the legal distinction between conqueror and conquered. The half-century of crisis that followed, from 235 to 284 AD, saw over a dozen emperors, most dying violently, as the empire fractured under simultaneous barbarian invasions, Persian resurgence, and endless civil wars, nearly causing total collapse. Diocletian's rise in 280 marked a desperate and revolutionary restructuring The Tetrarchy divided the empire into eastern and western halves, each with a senior Augustus and a junior Caesar, attempting to provide multiple points of military command and a clear succession plan, while also vastly expanding the bureaucracy and attempting to freeze prices and professions to control a collapsing economy. His persecution of Christians was a final, failed attempt to impose religious unity as a pillar of the restored state, a policy reversed by his successor Constantine. Constantine's victory at the Milvian Bridge, 312 AD, and his subsequent Edict of Milan legalizing Christianity began the empire's transformation into a Christian state. His founding of Constantinople 330 AD strategically shifting the center of gravity to the more defensible and economically vibrant east. The Battle of Adrianople 378 AD, where the Emperor Valens and a Roman army were destroyed by Gothic cavalry, shattered the myth of Roman military invincibility and began the process of semi-autonomous barbarian groups settling within imperial borders. The final division of the empire into eastern and western halves after Theodosia's death 395 AD became permanent, with the west increasingly a patchwork of barbarian kingdoms under nominal Roman authority, while the east, with its greater resources and administrative cohesion, endured. A sack of Rome by Alaric's Visigoths in 410 AD sent a psychological shockwave through the ancient world, prompting Augustine to write The City of God, arguing for the primacy of the spiritual realm over the earthly empire. The deposition of the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, in 476 AD by the Germanic general Lode Asur, is a conventional end date, but the process was a prolonged whimper, not a single catastrophe, as Roman institutions and Latin culture gradually blended with Germanic and Christian elements. The Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire, with its capital at Constantinople, preserved Roman law, Greek learning, and imperial autocracy for another millennium, until its fall to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, acting as a crucial bulwark and transmitter of classical knowledge. The legacy of the Roman Empire, forged in the August settlement, is omnipresent in the Romance languages, in legal codes, in engineering principles, in the very concept of a unified Europe, and in the enduring tension between republican ideals of liberty and the imperial realities of centralized power. Vespasian, emerging victorious from the civil war of 16 AD, restored discipline to the state finances through heavy taxation and reclaimed public land, demonstrating that the empire could survive and recover from the brink of collapse. His son Titus, despite a brief reign marked by the catastrophic eruption of Vesuvius and the completion of the Colosseum, was remembered for his generosity, though his popularity stemmed largely from lavish public spectacles funded by the Jewish war's spoils. Domitian, a younger brother, ruled with autocratic efficiency, strengthening the imperial bureaucracy, fortifying the frontiers, and persecuting perceived opponents. But his paranoid style and heavy exactions lead to his assassination and the Senate's damning of his memory. The subsequent Nerva-Antonine dynasty, beginning with the elderly and mild Nerva, institutionalized the principle of adoptive succession, choosing the most capable man rather than a biological heir, which ushered in Rome's golden age of stable, competent rule. Trajan, a brilliant military commander from Hispania, expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent, conquering Dacia and its gold mines and briefly capturing the Parthian capital Casitzum, while also implementing extensive public building programs and a welfare system for poor children. The Alimentae, Hadrian, his successor, reversed the policy of expansion, consolidating borders with physical fortifications like Hadrian's Wall in Britain and traveling incessantly to oversee provincial administration, promoting Greco-Roman culture and architectural projects like the Pantheon. Antony Spires presided over a remarkably peaceful and prosperous reign, a quiet zenith of the Pax Romana, where the empire's internal mechanisms of law, trade, and administration functioned smoothly with minimal military conflict. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher minus emperor, was compelled to spend much of his reign on the turbulent Danube frontier fighting Germanic and Sarmatian tribes. His stoic reflections and meditations composed in military camps, while also confronting a devastating plague and a major rebellion in the east. His fateful decision to break the adoptive succession by passing power to his biological son, the brutish and megalomaniacal Commodus, shattered the stability of the previous century, plunging the empire back into the cycle of dynastic failure and military despotism. Commodus's reign degenerated into a farcical spectacle where he performed as a gladiator, identified himself with Hercules, and allowed the Praetorian prefect and his courtiers to administer the state, leading to his eventual strangulation and a renewed period of civil war. The Severan dynasty that followed, founded by the African general Septimus Severus, explicitly grounded its legitimacy in military support, telling his sons to enrich the soldiers and scorn all others, a policy that permanently increased the political power and financial burden of the army. His son Caracalla, who murdered his brother Geta, is chiefly remembered for the Constitutio Antoniana, granting Roman citizenship to virtually all free inhabitants of the empire, a move less about universal rights than about expanding the tax base for his swollen military budget. The half-century following the Severans, from 235 to 284 AD, known as the crisis of the 3rd century, witnessed over 24 emperors, most dying violently, as the empire fractured under simultaneous invasions across the Rhine, Danube, and Persian frontiers, rampant inflation, provincial secession, and economic collapse. Diocletian, a soldier of humbled Dalmatian origin, seized power in 284 and implemented a revolutionary restructuring, the Tetrarchy, dividing the empire into Eastern and Western, as each ruled by an Augustus and a Junius Caesar, attempting to provide multiple military commanders and a clear succession plan to end the cycle of civil wars. He also attempted comprehensive economic controls, the edict on maximum prices, then persecuted Christians in a final, failed effort to impose religious uniformity as a pillar of the restored state, his reforms saving the empire from disintegration, but at the cost of creating a more regimented, bureaucratic, and oppressive state. Constantine I, emerging from the subsequent civil wars, consolidated Diocletian's reforms while decisively shifting course by legalizing Christianity after his vision, before the Battle of the Milvia en Brig, later convening the Council of Nicaea to define Orthodox doctrine, and founding Constantinople as a new Christian capital in the East, strategically positioned at the crossroads of trade and military routes. The empire gradually and permanently split into Eastern and Western, as after the death of Theodosius I in 395, with the West, its economy weaker and its frontiers longer, succumbing to a process of infiltration, settlement, and eventual takeover by various Germanic tribes, culminating in the deposition of the last Western emperor in 476. The Eastern Roman Empire, later called Byzantium, with its richer economy, defensible capital, and Greek administrative tradition, endured for another 1,000 years, preserving Roman law, classical learning, and serving as a bulwark for Europe, until Constantinople finally fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. The legacy of the Roman Empire, forged in the August settlement, and refined through centuries of crisis and adaptation, is embedded in the languages, laws, political structures, engineering concepts, and even the road networks of modern Europe, a testament to its unparalleled duration and depth of influence on Western civilization. The crisis of the 3rd century revealed the fundamental instability of the imperial system when faced with simultaneous military, economic, and political collapse. Diocletian's radical reforms, including the Tetrarchy and price controls, were desperate attempts to impose order through top-down coercion and administrative division. Constantine's embrace of Christianity began the profound transformation of the empire's ideological foundation, from pagan state cult to a universal religion with its own power structure. The founding of Constantinople established a new, defensible capital that would serve as the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire for over a millennium. The Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD shattered the Roman army's reputation at invincibility and demonstrated the growing power of migratory Germanic tribes. Theodosius I made Christianity the official state religion, further unifying religious and political authority, but also intensifying conflict with traditionalists and Christian heretics. After Theodosius's death in 395 AD, the division between the Eastern and Western Roman empires became permanent, each following its own destiny. The Western Empire, strained by weaker economies, longer frontiers, and internal power struggles, gradually disintegrated under the pressure of barbarian invasions and settlements. Key figures like the general Stili Chung, a Vandal by birth, symbolized the era where barbarian commanders held the real power behind crumbling imperial institutions. The sack of Rome by Alaric the Visigoth in 410 AD was a psychological catastrophe that shook the ancient world's belief in Roman eternal security. Attila the Hun's devastating raids in the mid-5th century further weakened the Western Empire's infrastructure and drained its remaining resources. The final Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed in 476 AD by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer, an event later romanticized as the fall of Rome. In reality, the Western Empire faded rather than fell, as Roman law, landowning elites, and the Latin language slowly blended with Germanic customs and new kingdoms. The Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantium, preserved Roman law, Greek philosophy, and a sophisticated bureaucracy from its capital Constantinople. Emperor Justinian I in the 6th century briefly reconquered parts of the West, codified Roman law in the Corpus Juris Civilis, and built architectural marvels like the Hagia Sophia. The Byzantine Empire faced perpetual threats from the Persians Assandides, Arab Caliphates, Slavic tribes, and later, the Seljuk and Ottoman Turks. The Great Schism of 1054 formally divided Christianity into Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches, reflecting the deepening cultural and political rift between East and West. The Crusades, launched from Western Europe, ironically weakened Byzantium by sacking Constantinople in 1204, fatally crippling the empire. Constantinople finally fell to the Ottoman Turks under Mehmed I in 1453, marking the definitive end of the Roman imperial tradition in the East. The Roman Empire's legacy is omnipresent in modern Europe in Romance languages derived from Latin, in legal systems based on Roman law, and in concepts of citizenship, statehood, and infrastructure. The Roman Catholic Church preserved Latin and administrative structures, becoming the primary vessel of Roman heritage in the West during the Middle Ages. The ideal of a unified Europe, resurrected by Charlemagne and later political projects, consciously drew upon the memory of the Roman Empire. The tension between republican liberty and imperial authority, exemplified by the end of the Republic, became a central theme in Western political philosophy. Roman engineering principles influenced architecture, aqueducts, and road construction for centuries, while its literary and historical works formed the core of the classical education canon. The empire's history serves as a perpetual case study in the rise and fall of great powers, the challenges of governing diverse populations, and the consequences of overexpansion. Thus, the world shaped by Augustus's victory over Antony evolved into a civilization whose echoes still fundamentally define the legal, linguistic, and cultural landscape of the Western world. Minus Alexander's theories soon became a reality. North Macedonia was besieged by restless tribes, and rebellions would erupt whenever Philippi turned his attention elsewhere. When Alexander was still a boy, another rebellion broke out, and this time Philippi was abroad negotiating. The king needed a trustworthy man to stabilize the kingdom. He chose Alexander. The news shocked the entire court. Skeptical nobles whispered that Philippi had gone mad. Alexander was indeed exceptionally talented. Yes, but he was still a child. Even experienced generals need to proceed with caution when leading an army against a stubborn tribal militia. At Philippi, I did not hesitate. He wanted to know if his successor could withstand the pressure, whether all the training, thought, and exercises had truly shaped it. Alexander seized the opportunity with passion and unwavering determination. Clad in slightly oversized armor, he led the Macedonian cavalry north, accompanied only by a few experienced generals who secretly hoped to come to his rescue if things went wrong. They knew nothing about Alexander. He meticulously studied the terrain, consulted scouts, and planned ambushes with a strategic clarity that astonished his men. Alexander's actions were not those of a reckless youth, but those of a wise man who had studied military strategy since childhood, and he truly was. When the Arians attempted a surprise attack on Macedonia, Alexander preemptively struck. He launched a sudden cavalry flanking maneuver, routing the enemy before they could even react and lose their advantage. Veterans later recalled that Alexander's actions were as if whispered in their ears by the gods. Indeed, this stemmed from his years of absorbing Philippi strategies and refining them with Aristotelian logic, but also from a more dangerous factor: Alexander's determination to prove himself. The victory came swiftly and decisively. When Philippi returned in triumph, he found the rebellion suppressed and the borders secured. Even more astonishingly, Alexander's army idolized him. He led from the front, sharing the hardships of his soldiers, displaying an almost reckless courage. But first Philippi remained silent, but later, according to court rumors, he privately admitted, "My son craves victory as if it were his doom." Those nobles who had mocked Alexander's youthful arrogance now watched him with a complex mix of unease and awe. Macedonia saw for the first time the superstar he might become. Alexander, too, tasted the intoxicating allure, not just glory, but the position of commander. He craved more. By 17, Alexander was no longer merely Philippi's son. He had become a powerful force, ominous, inspiring, and admired throughout the Macedonian court, an undeniable and talked minus about power. His early victories over the northern tribes had transformed him from a gifted youth into a true commander. Aristotle's teachings had honed his intellect, making it both sharp and dangerous. The ambition he had whispered while reading Homer's epics by lamplight was now laid bare, clear to anyone who dared look him in the eye. Yet, greatness, even in its nascent stages, is always accompanied by shadows. The first shadow was Philippi himself. Her relationship was complex, a mixture of admiration and competition, pride and tension. Philippi saw a reflection of his own talents in Alexander, perhaps an overly accurate projection. The boy was disciplined, charismatic, and stubborn, but unruly. Philippi, who had climbed to the pinnacle of power through perseverance and strategy, sometimes felt uneasy about his son's unusual confidence. The court nobles sensed this tension and exploited it. Some whispered flattery in Alexander's ear: "You are the true heir. Your father's error is over." Others spread rumors: "Philippi favors your half-minus brother. Be careful." Alexander gradually understood that political dangers often creep in silently. Meanwhile, Olympia's influence grew daily. She protected Alexander diligently, constantly warning him that enemies lurked in the shadows, waiting for Philippi to lower his guard. She both fueled his sense of responsibility and intensified his fear of betrayal. These two emotions intertwined, igniting a raging fire within him. Ambition clashed with obsession, courage with doubt. Even in such a tense atmosphere, Alexander's confidence grew stronger each day. He devoured history, studied battles, and meticulously planned his future conquests. When he gazed at a map of the known world, he saw not boundaries, but a starting point. His youthful thoughts had already drifted eastward to Persia, a vast kingdom that had dominated Greece for over a century. Most Greeks feared Persia. Alexander studied it like a hunter studies a lion. But for now, he had to be patient. Philippi was preparing for the greatest campaign of his life, the invasion of Persia. Alexander would participate, perhaps even command it himself. The world was opening its doors to him. Vespasian, emerging victorious from the civil war of 16 AD, restored discipline to the state finances through heavy taxation and reclaimed public land, demonstrating that the empire could survive and recover from the brink of collapse. His son Titus, despite a brief reign marked by the catastrophic eruption of Vesuvius and the completion of the Colosseum, was remembered for his generosity. While his popularity stemmed largely from lavish public spectacles funded by the Jewish war's spoils, Domitian, the younger brother, ruled with autocratic efficiency, strengthening the imperial bureaucracy, fortifying the frontiers, and persecuting perceived opponents. But his paranoid style and heavy exactions lead to his assassination and the Senate's damning of his memory, the subsequent Nerva-Antonine dynasty, beginning with the elderly and mild Nerva, institutionalized the principle of adoptive succession, choosing the most capable man rather than a biological heir, which ushered in Rome's golden age of stable, competent rule. Trajan, a brilliant military commander from Hispania, expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent, conquering Dacia and its gold mines and briefly capturing the Parthian capital Casitzum, while also implementing extensive public building programs and a welfare system for poor children. The Alimente, Hadrian, his successor, reversed the policy of expansion, consolidating borders with physical fortifications like Hadrian's Wall in Britain and traveling incessantly to oversee provincial administration, promoting Greco-Roman culture and architectural projects like the Pantheon. Antony Spires presided over a remarkably peaceful and prosperous reign, a quiet zenith of the Pax Romana, where the empire's internal mechanisms of law, trade, and administration functioned smoothly with minimal military conflict. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, was compelled to spend much of his reign on the turbulent Danube frontier fighting Germanic and Sarmatian tribes, his stoic reflections and meditations composed in military camps, while also confronting a devastating plague and a major rebellion in the east. His fateful decision to break the adoptive succession by passing power to his biological son, the brutish and megalomaniacal Commodus, shattered the stability of the previous century, plunging the empire back into the cycle of dynastic failure and military despotism. Commodus's reign degenerated into a farcical spectacle where he performed as a gladiator, identified himself with Hercules, and allowed the Praetorian prefect and his courtiers to administer the state, leading to his eventual strangulation and a renewed period of civil war. The Severan dynasty that followed, founded by the African general Septimus Severus, explicitly grounded its legitimacy in military support, telling his sons to enrich the soldiers and scorn all others, a policy that permanently increased the political power and financial burden of the army. His son Caracalla, who murdered his brother Geta, is chiefly remembered for the Constitutio Antoniana, granting Roman citizenship to virtually all free inhabitants of the empire, a move less about universal rights than about expanding the tax base for his swollen military budget. The half-century following the Severans, from 235 to 284 AD, known as the crisis of the 3rd century, witnessed over 24 emperors, most dying violently, as the empire fractured under simultaneous invasions across the Rhine, Danube, and Persian frontiers, rampant inflation, provincial secession, and economic collapse. Diocletian, a soldier of humble Dalmatian origin, seized power in 284 and implemented a revolutionary restructuring, the Tetrarchy, dividing the empire into Eastern and Western, as each ruled by an Augustus and a junior Caesar, attempting to provide multiple military commanders and a clear succession plan to end the cycle of civil wars. He also attempted comprehensive economic controls, the edict on maximum prices, then persecuted Christians in a final, failed effort to impose religious uniformity as a pillar of the restored state, his reforms saving the empire from disintegration, but at the cost of creating a more regimented, bureaucratic, and oppressive state. Constantine I, emerging from the subsequent civil wars, consolidated Diocletian's reforms while decisively shifting course by legalizing Christianity after his vision, before the Battle of the Milvia en Brig, later convening the Council of Nicaea to define Orthodox doctrine, and founding Constantinople as a new Christian capital in the East, strategically positioned at the crossroads of trade and military routes. The empire gradually and permanently split into Eastern and Western, as after the death of Theodosius I in 395, with the West, its economy weaker and its frontiers longer, succumbing to a process of infiltration, settlement, and eventual takeover by various Germanic tribes, culminating in the deposition of the last Western emperor in 476. The Eastern Roman Empire, later called Byzantium, with its richer economy, defensible capital, and Greek administrative tradition, endured for another 1,000 years, preserving Roman law, classical learning, and serving as a bulwark for Europe, until Constantinople finally fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. The legacy of the Roman Empire, forged in the August settlement and refined through centuries of crisis and adaptation, is embedded in the languages, laws, political structures, engineering concepts, and even the road networks of modern Europe, a testament to its unparalleled duration and depth of influence on Western civilization. The crisis of the 3rd century revealed the fundamental instability of the imperial system when faced with simultaneous military, economic, and political collapse. Diocletian's radical reforms, including the Tetrarch price controls, were desperate attempts to impose order through top-down coercion and administrative division. Constantine's embrace of Christianity began the profound transformation of the empire's ideological foundation from pagan state cult to a universal religion with its own power structure. The founding of Constantinople established a new, defensible capital that would serve as the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire for over a millennium. The Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD shattered the Roman army's reputation at invincibility and demonstrated the growing power of migratory Germanic tribes. Theodosius I made Christianity the official state religion, further unifying religious and political authority, but also intensifying conflict with traditionalists and Christian heretics. After Theodosius's death in 395 AD, the division between the Eastern and Western Roman empires became permanent, each following its own destiny. The Western Empire, strained by weaker economies, longer frontiers, and internal power struggles, gradually disintegrated under the pressure of barbarian invasions and settlements. Key figures like the general Stilicho, a Vandal by birth, symbolized the era where barbarian commanders held the real power behind crumbling imperial institutions. The sack of Rome by Alaric the Visigoth in 410 AD was a psychological catastrophe that shook the ancient world's belief in Roman eternal security. Attila the Hun's devastating raids in the mid-5th century further weakened the Western Empire's infrastructure and drained its remaining resources. The final Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed in 476 AD by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer, an event later romanticized as the fall of Rome. In reality, the Western Empire faded rather than fell, as Roman law, landowning elites, and the Latin language slowly blended with Germanic customs and new kingdoms. The Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantium, preserved Roman law, Greek philosophy, and a sophisticated bureaucracy from its capital Constantinople. Emperor Justinian I in the 6th century briefly reconquered parts of the West, codified Roman law in the Corpus Juris Civilis, and built architectural marvels like the Hagia Sophia. The Byzantine Empire faced perpetual threats from the Persians Assandides, Arab Caliphates, Slavic tribes, and later, the Seljuk and Ottoman Turks. The Great Schism of 1050 formally divided Christianity into Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches, reflecting the deepening cultural and political rift between East and West. The Crusades, launched from Western Europe, ironically weakened Byzantium by sacking Constantinople in 1204, fatally crippling the empire. Constantinople finally fell to the Ottoman Turks under Mehmed I in 1453, marking the definitive end of the Roman imperial tradition in the East. The Roman Empire's legacy is omnipresent in modern Europe in Romance languages derived from Latin, in legal systems based on Roman law, and in concepts of citizenship, statehood, and infrastructure. The Roman Catholic Church preserved Latin and administrative structures, becoming the primary vessel of Roman heritage in the West during the Middle Ages. The ideal of a unified Europe, resurrected by Charlemagne and later political projects, consciously drew upon the memory of the Roman Empire. The tension between republican liberty and imperial authority, exemplified by the end of the Republic, became a central theme in Western political philosophy. Roman engineering principles influenced architecture, aqueducts, and road construction for centuries, while its literary and historical works formed the core of the classical education canon. The empire's history shows as a perpetual case study in the rise and fall of great powers, the challenges of governing diverse populations, and the consequences of overexpansion. Thus, the world shaped by Augustus's victory over Antony evolved into a civilization whose echoes still fundamentally define the legal, linguistic, and cultural landscape of the Western world. Minus Alexander's theories soon became a reality. North Macedonia was besieged by restless tribes, and rebellions would erupt whenever Philippi turned his attention elsewhere. When Alexander was still a boy, another rebellion broke out, and this time Philippi was abroad negotiating. The king needed a trustworthy man to stabilize the kingdom. He chose Alexander. The news shocked the entire court. Skeptical nobles whispered that Philippi had gone mad. Alexander was indeed exceptionally talented. Yes, but he was still a child. Even experienced generals need to proceed with caution when leading an army against a stubborn tribal militia. At Philippi I did not hesitate. He wanted to know if his successor could withstand the pressure, whether all the training, thought, and exercises had truly shaped it. Alexander seized the opportunity with passion and unwavering determination. Clad in slightly oversized armor, he led the Macedonian cavalry north, accompanied only by a few experienced generals who secretly hoped to come to his rescue if things went wrong. They knew nothing about Alexander. He meticulously studied the terrain, consulted scouts, and planned ambushes with a strategic clarity that astonished his men. Alexander's actions were not those of a reckless youth, but those of a wise man who had studied military strategy since childhood, and he truly was. When the Arians attempted a surprise attack on Macedonia, Alexander preemptively struck. He launched a sudden cavalry flanking maneuver, routing the enemy before they could even react and lose their advantage. Veterans later recalled that Alexander's actions were as if whispered in their ears by the gods. Indeed, this stemmed from his years of absorbing Philippi's strategies and refining them with Aristotelian logic, but also from a more dangerous factor: Alexander's determination to prove himself. The victory came swiftly and decisively. When Philippi returned in triumph, he found the rebellions suppressed and the borders secured. Even more astonishingly, Alexander's army idolized him. He led from the front, sharing the hardships of his soldiers, displaying an almost reckless courage. At first, Philippi remained silent, but later, according to court rumors, he privately admitted, "My son craves victory as if it were his doom." Those nobles who had mocked Alexander's youthful arrogance now watched him with a complex mix of unease and doubt. Macedonia saw for the first time the superstar he might become. Alexander, too, tasted the intoxicating allure, not just glory, but the position of commander. He craved more. By 17, Alexander was no longer merely Philippi's son. He had become a powerful force, inspiring and admired throughout the Macedonian court, an undeniable and talked about power. His early victories over the northern tribes had transformed him from a gifted youth into a true commander. Aristotle's teachings had honed his intellect, making it both sharp and dangerous. The ambition he had whispered while reading Homer's epics by lamplight was now laid bare, clear to anyone who dared look him in the eye. Yet, greatness, even in its nascent stages, is always accompanied by shadows. The first shadow was Philippi himself. Her relationship was complex, a mixture of admiration and competition, pride and tension. Philippi saw a reflection of his own talents in Alexander, perhaps an overly accurate projection. The boy was disciplined, charismatic, and stubborn, but unruly. Philippi, who had climbed to the pinnacle of power through perseverance and strategy, sometimes felt uneasy about his son's unusual confidence. The court nobles sensed this tension and exploited it. Some whispered flattery in Alexander's ear, "You are the true heir. Your father's heir is over." Others spread rumors, "Philippi favors your half-brother. Be careful." Alexander gradually understood that political dangers often creep in silently. Meanwhile, Olympia's influence grew daily. She protected Alexander diligently, constantly warning him that enemies lurked in the shadows, waiting for Philippi to lower his guard. She both fueled his sense of responsibility and intensified his fear of betrayal. These two emotions intertwined, igniting a raging fire within him. Ambition clashed with obsession, courage with doubt. Even in such a tense atmosphere, Alexander's confidence grew stronger each day. He devoured history, studied battles, and meticulously planned his future conquests. When he gazed at a map of the known world, he saw not boundaries, but a starting point. His youthful thoughts had already drifted eastward to Persia, a vast kingdom that had dominated Greece for over a century. Most Greeks feared Persia. Alexander studied it like a hunter studies a lion. But for now, he had to be patient. Philippi I was preparing for the greatest campaign of his life, the invasion of Persia. Alexander would participate, perhaps even command it himself. The world was opening its doors to him.